Hello, my name is Edward Gonzalez Tennant, and I thank you for having me here virtually today. I'm going to be talking about some historical background in relation to rosewood. Specifically, I'll start by discussing how peoples of African descent have been an integral part of Florida's history, and in the following 5 centuries, how these individuals have faced numerous struggles. The institution of slavery is, of course, perhaps the best well-known example, although Jim Crow and various institutional assaults on black suffrage and opportunity continue to this day. I'll also discuss our work in Royal documenting its unique cultural heritage and conclude by discussing our progress towards listing the site on the National Register of Historic Places. Free Africans were among the crews of the first European explorers to Florida. While many of these expeditions proved disastrous for their leaders, numerous persons of African descent escaped during the first half of the 1500s, learned native customs and languages, and remained in Florida. In several locations, these early populations of free Africans eventually gave rise to self-governing groups. Throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, enslaved Africans from nearby locations continued to seek sanctuary in St. Augustine and elsewhere. Many runaway slaves were granted sanctuary and eventually received a town charter in 1738. Located 2 miles north of St. Augustine, this new town is known today as Fort Mose. The town was eventually fortified and occupied until Spain lost Florida to the British in 1763. Although slavery remained a feature of the first Spanish period, people of African descent had many paths toward freedom, including purchasing their way out of slavery. These paths mostly vanished under British rule. After the American Revolution, British loyalists fled Florida and the Second Spanish period commenced in 1783. Enslaved blacks once again sought sanctuary here, and the population of free blacks quickly grew. The increasing power of the young USA signaled the first impediment to this new life, when Spain relented to growing pressure from the nation's Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and revoked sanctuary in 1790. During this time, Britain worked closely with their allies in the former colony of West Florida and constructed a large fort along the Apalachicola River known as Prospect Bluff. In 1816, a battle initiated by U.S. forces resulted in the complete destruction of the fort. Hundreds of nearby Maroons fled the area, moved southward, and settled in numerous locations. The destruction of this site set into motion a series of migrations that would fundamentally transform relations between peoples of African descent and Florida's indigenous Seminole populations. Although the U.S. agreed to honor the rights of free blacks, it increasingly instituted a system of slavery. This drove many free black communities to migrate to the Bahamas, Cuba, and elsewhere in the Caribbean. Deepening ties between free blacks and the Seminoles continued. Several researchers have suggested that this growing connection represents a key reason that the Second Seminole War began in 1835 and ended in 1842. In fact, this means the conflict was one of the largest slave rebellions in our nation's history. Only 16% of plantations had enough slaves to form family units in the 1820s, a number that only rose to 29% by 1860. By 1861, the population of Florida included 104,000 whites and approximately 62,000 African American slaves, most of whom resided in the state's northern counties. During the Civil War, news from Union raids alerted enslaved Africans to the possibility of emancipation, and upwards of 1,000 people escaped and enlisted with the Union. Following the Civil War, the period known as Reconstruction saw many African Americans exercising civil liberties for the first time, especially their right to vote. Such was the case in 1874 when African Americans in Cedar Key elected a black mayor, marshal, and 3 aldermen. Perhaps the most prominent example of a burgeoning black political class was the life of Josiah T. Walls. Born a slave in Virginia, Walls served in the Union Army and settled in Florida after the war. He was elected to the Florida Senate in 1869 and went on to become the state's first African American member of the U.S. House of Representatives in 1871. During Reconstruction, freed African Americans were increasingly coerced to vote against their own interests. More violent means of black repression emerged as the state's Ku Klux Klan grew in power. The rise of violent interpersonal attacks against African Americans reached its nadir in the early and mid-20th century. Lynching, dynamite bombings, and race riots would eventually cast a dark shadow across the state's historical legacy. The end of Reconstruction in 1877 saw the emergence of a convict lease system, which leased state penitentiary inmates to private businesses, a system disproportionately affecting African Americans. The passage of a poll tax in 1885 resulted in black voter turnout plummeting from 62 to just 11% in the following years. 2 years later, in 1887, a state law required separate train cars for black and white passengers. Segregation had taken root in Florida. The establishment of numerous railroads promoted the settling of several African American towns. Well-known examples include Eatonville and Rosewood. Although never incorporated, Rosewood nonetheless became a prosperous African American community in the decades following statehood and transitioned to a majority African American community by 1900. Rosewood, in a now famous case, was destroyed in 1923 during a week-long series of events known today as the Rosewood Massacre. Value associated with properties along the railroad was a major impetus for whites destroying the community. Another rural location with a similar history is the community of Santos near Ocala. Settled in the 1880s, it was eventually displaced through development associated with the failed cross-Florida barge canal. Here, transportation-related violence took a different approach. Residents were offered fair market value for their properties, which they took, but when the canal was canceled, former residents were not allowed to return. Today, the area boasts a bike trail and series of hiking paths. Most of who use the facilities are unaware of this history. By 1900, the state's African American population had grown to 265,000. African Americans outnumbered whites in many of the state's cities, including Jacksonville, Tallahassee, Daytona, Palatka, Sanford, and Marianna. A vibrant black middle class quickly arose. Across the state, educated and skilled African Americans developed networks that supported educational institutions, business ventures, and recreational activities. During the early 20th century, Florida led the nation in lynching deaths per capita, offsetting this progress in violent ways. Attempts to exercise economic and political rights by blacks were violently repressed across the state. Such was the case in Ocoee, when African Americans attempted to vote, and the Klan and local whites lynched one of those attempting to vote, most likely killed another, burned a portion of the black neighborhood, and violently displaced a portion of the African American population. Another case study from Orlando, where our conference is this week, illustrates how transportation impacted African American communities across the 20th century. This includes the town of Paramore, located to the west of Division Avenue, so named because it has and continues to denote the separation of black and white Orlando. In 1957, I-4 tore through this area, reinforcing the division between black and white Orlando, first defined in the 1880s by the railroad. In 1974, the 408 further split the area. It resulted in the destruction of 1,000 homes, upwards of 200 businesses, and at least 3 African American churches. Researchers estimate upwards of 600 renters lost their homes. These and similar events drove a reversal of the population growth which had characterized the state's African American population in previous centuries. The mass exodus of Florida's black population coincided with a larger migration of southern African Americans to northern cities. This great migration deeply impacted the state of Florida. The subsequent brain and talent drain threatened Florida's African American population, but brave citizens stepped forward to lead the community through the remainder of the 20th century. Black newspapers like Pensacola's Florida Sentinel and the Tampa Bulletin circulated news of interest to the community. New chapters of the NAACP were formed. Greater segments of Florida's white population stood alongside their black neighbors during this time. In 1937, Governor Ernest Graham, father of future Governor Bob Graham, successfully repealed the poll tax. Unfortunately, white support for African Americans remained uneven. Violence erupted in Groveland, not far from Orlando to the west, in 1949, following the torture of 4 African Americans and murder of 2 of them by Lake County Sheriff Willis McCall. 2 years later, the Ku Klux Klan dynamited the home of Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore, who were instrumental in the fight for equal rights in the state. By the mid-20th century, most of the rural black settlements had dissolved as younger generations migrated to cities for educational and economic opportunities and fleeing rural anti-black violence. Royal remains a unique example of Florida's rural African American communities. Indeed, many of the original founders became property owners because of the Homestead Act of 1862. This act provided that any adult citizen who had never borne arms against the U.S. government could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. As such, Royal stands out as one of the few remaining black homestead colonies in the entire country. The majority of such communities in Florida have all but disappeared, often through overt violence or development-led displacement, as in the cases mentioned earlier. Royal's first period of development began in 1870, since most patents were granted as early as 1875 and required the owner to have successfully lived on the property for at least 5 years previously. The original settlers and their descendants grew tobacco and sugarcane, raised cattle and hogs, grew cotton, as well as other crops. Men and boys would lay out the rows and prepare the soil with handheld hoes. Women and girls would physically plant the tobacco. Royal's second period of development took place between 1882 and the early 1910s. In addition to renaming the community to Royal, federal and state census record a rapid growth in residents occurring during this time. This is further evidenced by the appearance of additional commercial and community structures. By the 1930s, oral histories in Royal attribute the creation of the Works Public Administration, or WPA, to providing employment opportunities to several community members. They used these to build a new, larger school in Royal to accommodate growing numbers of children. Royal's residents continued small-scale farming, with only minor amounts of mechanization. Focus on tobacco and sugarcane waned, but was never entirely abandoned. Today, residents of Royal, descendants of the area's 19th century black homesteaders, live on the original lands obtained by their ancestors. This is a direct and tangible connection with the first period of settlement and development. Buildings and structures from Royal's other periods of growth still stand. Tobacco barns were built and rebuilt across Royal until at least the mid-20th century. The investment in masonry construction reflects continued agricultural prosperity in the community. Families continue traditional agricultural even now. They raise cattle, they raise hogs. Small-scale cane processing takes place each fall and winter across the community and is a beloved annual event. Efforts to commemorate this history by groups such as the local Masons, the Royal Women's Group, Busy Bees Youth Club, and individuals like Beverly Steele and organizations like Young Performing Artists, Inc. also play a significant role in preserving this heritage. Educating the next generation about historic agricultural practices and commemorating African American history is crucial to understanding the significance of Royal in a state where few, if any, similar communities exist in the present. Efforts to add Royal to the National Register began years ago. I became involved when my partner's company, Digital Heritage Interactive, LLC, was contracted by Young Performing Artists, Inc. to conduct a Cultural Resources Assessment Survey, or CRAS, in 2017. A large portion of that earlier project was dedicated to delineating an area of significance based on Royal's historic boundaries. Although many of the modern residents are descendants of 19th century African American landowners, documenting the surviving architectural resources is central to determining the community's historical significance. Our work identified and added 31 new historic structures to the Florida Master Site File. This included private residences, commercial structures, and agricultural buildings. More recently, we have completed the nomination with over 100 pages of supporting documentation. We've added dozens of additional archaeological sites and architectural resources. Today, nearly 70 contributing structures have been documented, as well as hundreds of non-contributing structures and buildings. Many of these are not non-contributing because they are not related to the statement of significance, but rather they do not meet the 50-year limit. As such, many, perhaps a majority of these resources will be available to add to the rural historic landscape in coming years. Our nomination lists Royal as a rural historic landscape. These are typically defined as a geographical place that has been historically used by a group of people, shaped by that use, or offer an example of continuity and land use patterns. In the language of the NRHP, Royal is significant at the local and state levels under Criterion A, Ethnic Heritage, for African American. The landscape is also significant at the local and state level under Criterion A, Agriculture. The community of Royal is significant at the local, state, and national levels under Criterion A for Exploration and Settlement. It's also significant under Criterion A, Community Planning and Development, as the community retains a cohesive method of expanding which centered around family groups. The original settlers deeded portions of their 40, 80, or 160 acre tracts to their children so they could homestead and farm as well. Currently, the final nomination has been delivered to the state of Florida and is on track to be reviewed by the National Park Service in November. So thank you again for having me. I Apologize that I couldn't be there in person, having just moved to Texas about a month ago, and I am now teaching at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. Here's my contact information. Feel free to send me questions. I hope you have a wonderful conversation about this incredibly important and unique cultural heritage place in Central Florida. Thank you.